Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 6. This unit, we are going to talk about disorders of stress and trauma. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this unit in two videos. So the first video is going to discuss the stress response of PTSD, and the second video will talk more about dissociative disorders. So let's get started. For this chapter, we are going to talk about acute and post-traumatic stress disorders as well as dissociative disorders. And all of these disorders that we are going to address have a lot to do with trauma and the stress response. And so we're going to delve into that. So we're going to revisit the fight or flight response, which you may have recalled in taking Psych 150. Hopefully, if you had me, you'll remember that. We're going to look at the different disorders, acute and post-traumatic stress disorders. I'm going to now refer to it as PTSD from this point onward. Dissociative disorders and what their triggers are, how they develop, and how they're often treated. So let's get started. So in disorders of stress and trauma, I'm sorry, y'all. Let me repeat that. Disorders of stress and trauma. Stress, it's kind of something we all have an idea of what it is, right? It's we think of it as inherently a bad thing, but sometimes it's normal and there are good stressors in our life. For example, graduating from college. It's a little stressful time going out into the job field, but it's also good. It motivates us, right? Stress is a good source of motivation. But if you have too much stress, this can lead to detriments, right? So stress has two components. Remember, stress is just like sometimes feelings of anxiety, sometimes a fear or panic response, right? Well, stress is going to have a stressor and a stress response. So the stressor is the event that creates the demands in and of itself. So this could be, in some cases in psychological disorders, trauma that has occurred, or it can also be maybe an upcoming test or exam. Those are stressors, right? A stress response is just going to be the individual's reaction to the demands. So the individual's reaction to the stressors. All right? And that stress response is going to yield or lead to arousal and fear. So there are different components to this fear response. There's physical aspects, cognitive, and emotional responses to stress. Right? Physical, sometimes we may have heart palpitations. We may get a little shaky. May feel a little bit, then we have our emotional responses. So maybe we start to panic, have a little anxiety, sometimes engage in maladaptive cognitive patterns. So thinking, oh, if I don't pass this test, I'm not going to pass the class. If I don't pass the test, or if I don't pass the class, then I won't be able to graduate on time, whatever on time means to you, right? So there's different components and different kind of strands of physical, cognitive, emotional responses people have. And it varies based on the stressor and how the person deals with that stressor. Because two people faced with the same stressor, the same event, are going to have different responses, right? Some people are more resilient in dealing with stress than others. But one thing that's important to note is that a large number of stressful events, so if someone repeatedly has stressful events in their life or perceives stressors as highly stressful, this has been related to an array of anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, sexual dysfunctions, and other psychological problems. So what we're going to look at today is how it relates to PTSD and acute stress disorders. This is just a brief refresher on the nervous system, okay? Because what we're about to talk about is the arousal aspect, of our autonomic nervous system. So if you took Psych 150 in my class, I used the same exact image to discuss the peripheral nervous system and how it's divided into the autonomic and somatic subsections. Well, the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division is what is going to be responsible for arousal, and that's going to be activated by the stressor. So this is where we see the fight or flight response occurring. It's gearing our bodies up to deal with the stressor. So hopefully this will bring back some memories for y'all, especially if you talked about the fight or flight response before. That is going to occur in the sympathetic division of your nervous system. And further addressing that, we're going to specifically look at how our body and the hypothalamus is responsible for taking that stressor and kind of reading it and deciding how our body should react to it. So there's two major pathways we're going to look at based on the sympathetic nervous system, which we've talked about previously in Psych 150. You have the various organs. We kind of directly activate them with chemical messengers, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are going to be huge components of activating our autonomic nervous system, which is going to be responsible for, raising our heart rate, maybe changing our blood pressure, dilating our pupils, maybe even sweating a little bit. That's that arousal and fear reaction in terms of neurotransmitters. Well, the hypothalamus, remember, that's the part that's responsible for a lot of our homeostatic processes. It will also activate our pituitary gland. It's also known as the master gland because it secretes a lot of hormones to help regulate different things, especially in terms of sexual growth in our bodies. In this case, it is going to release, I can't even pretend to know how to pronounce this, but I'm going to just call it ACTH because I don't want to mess it up for you. But the main point is that it is a corticosteroids, okay? So these are stress hormones specifically. So there are two pathways. Let me just recap. For stressors, one is going to be through neurotransmitters, changing neurotransmitters through the sympathetic nervous system, and the other is going to be the pituitary gland releasing corticosteroids into the bloodstream. So those stress hormones. So neurotransmitters and hormones, but it's both directed by the hypothalamus. Knowing which pathway is activated for different stressors, I will not pretend to know because it's hard. You can't tell in a scenario which one is going to be activated, right? Unless we're really measuring people with different biofeedback type stuff. But this is going to explain the fight or flight response from multiple perspectives. So the sympathetic nervous system, which you should already be familiar with, and if not, you got to recap, and the pituitary gland. So that's how our body deals with stress. And sometimes it's not so good at it, right? Those stressors can be triggers for certain people. Remember, we talk about the ideas of multifinality, okay, and equifinality. So these ideas that people from different scenarios can come to the same conclusion in terms of psychological disorders, or people in different or the same exact type of upbringings can have different diagnoses, right? So stress is very important for what's called the diathesis stress model. And this is not included in our text, but I should have mentioned it with our anxiety section. Someone's propensity to have a psychological disorder, specifically this section when we talk about stressors and trauma, is going to be dictated by their predisposition or vulnerability to inheriting a certain developmental disorder. So some people may be more predispositioned to have PTSD than others. Well, that diathesis or predisposition plus the certain stressors in that person's life will yield the development of the disorder. It seems like a simple formula, but it's actually really individualized. It's different depending on which individual we're analyzing, because one stressor that may seem minor may activate someone's predisposition to develop a disorder, whereas other people are more resilient in dealing with those stressors. And sometimes in the case of PTSD, it is really difficult in trying to manage the trauma and the effects of that trauma. And so this is going to be your trigger warning for the content as we proceed ahead. We are going to talk about sexual assault, rape, death, and near-death experiences. So if you should have any trouble with this content, please let me know, and we will adjust your assignments accordingly. With acute and PTSD. So, long story short, these are going to have the same symptoms, okay, as you're going to see in our diagnostic checklist here for PTSD. The only difference is going to be the passage of time. So acute stress disorder is going to be the same type of fear and related symptoms soon after experiencing a traumatic event, but less than a month. Usually 50% of the cases of acute stress disorder actually lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, which is long after a traumatic event. For example, you may have heard Vietnam veterans who have PTSD who are still having these symptoms today, 40 years later. Oh, 50. Oh, wow. Yeah. 50 some odd years later. And what we need to know about the traumatic event, because I feel like PTSD as a term gets thrown around a lot. A traumatic event, in terms of psychology, we're going to look at one in which a person is exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. This can be anything from sexual assault to rape, and those are two different things. A serious injury or near death, or maybe like a paramedic who has been called to an area where a lot of gunshot wounds are prevalent, right? They could develop PTSD from trying to resuscitate and revive so many people who have died. These are all traumatic events that could stress the person so much to the point where they develop PTSD. Now, what is PTSD in terms of the DSM diagnostic checklist? Well, the person's exposed to a traumatic event. That's an essential, okay? And we have our definition of what that traumatic event may be. Then we also have that the person experiences at least one of the following intrusive symptoms. So when something's intrusive, it's invading their mind against their will. So repeated, uncontrolled, and distressing memories. So sometimes dating back to the event, they might have flashbacks or trauma-linked dreams, okay? So sometimes they have certain triggers that will kind of bring them back to the state of that traumatic event. Dissociative experiences such as flashbacks. When someone dissociates, they're kind of separating from the world around them. It's kind of almost hypnotic in a sense. And I'm going to explain dissociation a bit more with the dissociative disorders. But just know it's like a way to separate from your full awareness. So in Psych 150, when we talk about consciousness and different levels of consciousness and awareness, it's a lower level of consciousness because we're not really attuned to what's currently happening around us. And we're kind of dissociating or separating from that. Significant upset when exposed to trauma-linked cues, and pronounced physical reactions when reminded of the event. So maybe they have panic attacks or heart palpitations, different things, maybe trouble breathing. These are all different things people could exhibit. So this person, because of all this, may continually avoid trauma-linked stimuli. I had a friend who served in the Iraq War, and he could not listen to fireworks because the explosives from the fireworks reminded him of being in combat. And so he avoided at all costs any kind of stimuli that would link back to that experience. This person usually experiences negative changes in trauma-linked cognition and moods, such as being able to remember key features of events or experiencing repeated negative emotions. In this case, when we say experiences negative changes, negative is kind of like a math problem, so taking away things. So in trauma-linked cognitions and moods, it kind of strips away their memory of the certain event. So when they say negative changes, they're saying something's being taken away. That's what we mean when we're reading the DSM criteria. And then we also have that the person displays conspicuous changes in arousal or reactivity, so where it's really noticeable. So excessive alertness, extreme startle responses, or sleep disturbances. And that makes sense because they're having distressing memories, distressing dreams, trying to avoid those stimuli that may be around them, that maybe they've learned to generalize with other stimuli. So maybe at first it's fireworks. A combat veteran can't hear fireworks because it triggers that response. Well, maybe then it just turns into loud noises in general, kind of triggers that response. So that anxiety that kind of follows can kind of spiral out of control in essence. And the person experiences significant distress or impairment with symptoms lasting more than a month. Remember, that distress or impairment is important because it's not allowing the person to function at the level at which they would like to, right? Their social interactions are being inhibited. Perhaps doing the job that they were hired to do is being inhibited. things of that nature, excuse me. So triggers for acute and post-traumatic stress disorders a lot of times is associated with combat veterans, and rightfully so. If you see these numbers, 29% of Vietnam vets came home with symptoms of PTSD, and 22%, an additional 22%, that's not 22% of 29, an additional 22% had other stress-like symptoms, and 10% still maintained PTSD stress symptoms. And that's how many years later, right? In terms of the recent Iraq and Afghanistan wars, 2.7 million veterans went over to fight in combat. 20% reported symptoms of PTSD. That is a very high number. So rightfully so, it's a great issue for the VA to deal with. And I've included a resource in your supplementary folder with more information concerning PTSD and the VA's outreach efforts. So check it out. It's got great things. But other triggers for acute and PTSD can be disasters and accidents. For example, 12 to 40% of people, regardless of their age or sex, have PTSD as a result of being in a car accident, right? Victimization. So this is like repeated abuse. Okay, we're talking about physical and sexual assault victims. 33% of people who have experienced victimization, repeated victimization, or it can be one time as well, experience PTSD. Just a quick kind of aside, so we know the difference, because these terms are talked about often now in our attempt to kind of dispel some of the negative notions surrounding rape culture. Sexual assault is when someone is forced to engage in sexual acts against their will. So sexual acts can range in any kind of sexual behavior. This could be like oral sex and different things of that nature, whereas rape in particular is forced into sexual intercourse or other forms of sexual penetration. So there is a difference. They both can be equally traumatizing for people, but just so we kind of can differentiation for the purpose of our class and for, when we hear these terms moving forward. Because rape is a hot topic of conversation, especially because still in the United States we have a tendency to victim blame, which if you check out the stats in your text, there's a whole infographic about the different ages and groups of people who experience rape and those encounters. Basically, kind of trying to... I'm searching this page while I'm trying to speak to you all. I obviously can't multitask right now. Excuse me. Let me find it. What page is that on? Page 161. It has a lot of information about sexual assault. Basically talking about how likely the victims of rape and sexual assault are to develop depression, contemplate suicide, suffer from PTSD, abuse drugs, as well as feel guilty about their experience, even though it was not at fault of their own. Okay, so just kind of dispel it for you all out there. It is never the victim's fault for a rape. It doesn't matter what they were wearing or what they were doing. The rape is the rapist's fault. And so that's kind of something that is a little outside of our purview of our class, but important to address. Because when we're talking about PTSD, a lot of people do not come forward to talk about their rape or sexual assault because we still have a victim blaming culture. So when these cases come forth, a lot of times they do feel guilty, and extreme guilt to the point where they may consider committing suicide, when really is no fault of their own. But because we have unsupportive criminal justice system, and a lot of victim blaming still prevalent, they do feel like it is their fault on some level. Just a quick factoid for you all, so you can contextualize this a little bit. About 91,000 cases of rape are reported in the U.S. in a year. but approximately 432,000 are perpetrated. So you see the great disparity in the amount of people who are actually coming forward with their experiences because of the extreme guilt and the victim blaming that surrounds this experience, this trauma. Terrorism and torture are other such triggers for PTSD. 50% of individuals exposed to terrorism experience some sort of acute and PTSD, which is a really high number, especially if you look at the number of New Yorkers who still to this day have very high fears concerning possible risks of terrorism after 9/11. And torture, because remember we talk about traumatic events being physical brutality in essence, and so torture uses physical, psychological, sexual, and deprivation-oriented techniques to disorient people and to kind of make them helpless in a sense. So we see this kind of in movies sometimes. There's physical beatings, there's psychological quote-unquote mind games. Sometimes it's a sexual nature. In the case of Abu Ghraib, it was a big controversy in the 2000s about U.S. soldiers who were sexually humiliating prisoners of war. And so that torture can also be a trigger for PTSD. And so why do people develop acute and post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, there could be biological factors that we talked about, disruption in those brain-body stress pathways, right? Our brain stress circuit is basically having misinformation between the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. The amygdala is really responsible for our emotional response. The prefrontal cortex is going to kind of assess that emotional response and throw it back to the amygdala and say, hey, you need to calm down. It's not that bad, this stressor of this test that's coming up. Well, that connection is kind of screwy, for lack of better words. So the amygdala and prefrontal cortex are not communicating well, as well as with the hippocampus, because the hippocampus is responsible for the memories. So sometimes those memories can kind of grow and grow and grow. Yes. So make sure you read that bit in our text, because I don't want to give you too much without you reading. And sometimes inherited predispositions, like we talked about with the diathesis stress model. Childhood experiences are also responsible, because think about it this way. Children are developing their stress reactions. They learn to develop emotional responses. If you took developmental psychology, you'll know what I'm talking about. But in essence, children are learning to grab a hold of their emotions and how they're going to react to different scenarios. So in this case, they kind of develop overly reactive stress pathways. And so it's kind of like this notion that if you do it once, you may be able to keep practicing it, and their bodies are used to developing in these overly reactive ways. And you know what? If a child experiences trauma, it's very detrimental, whereas if an adult experiences trauma, it's still very detrimental to their mental health. But because children are still developing, it's more likely to have greater impact. Then there's also the idea of personal styles. So if people think that things are generally outside of their control, or they're kind of negative, have negative thought patterns, can't really see the bright side of things, this can affect one's susceptibility to develop PTSD, because they're kind of already in that negative mindset. They may focus on those negative things over and over and over again. Social support systems, very important, okay? People who have better support systems, less likely to develop PTSD. It helps if, in a couple, if someone gets raped or sexually assaulted, it helps that their family and the couple knows how to deal with their trauma, so they have that support system at home. Okay, because sometimes there will be flashbacks, sometimes there will be sexual dysfunction, right? That future intercourse may be a trigger for previous experiences, and it's important that their social support systems know how to deal with that, as well as help the person. The severity and nature of the trauma, so how long it occurred and how intense it was, and all these different factors coming together. Again, that developmental pathological perspective. So looking at how people develop throughout their life, and when did this event happen, and did the timing of that traumatic event affect their susceptibility to develop PTSD. So how do they treat PTSD? Well, regardless of what kind of PTSD, what kind of trauma the person has experienced, the basic goal is going to be the same: to put an end to stress reactions, gain perspective on their painful experiences, so help that person to work through those experiences, and return to constructive living. So help them, ease some of that guilt. Sometimes people with PTSD who have seen combat have survivor's guilt. Helping them work through that guilt, helping them to be productive in their lives. Sometimes antidepressant drugs are going to help with that increased arousal state. Cognitive behavioral therapy, we're going to talk about CBT so much with all these different psychological disorders. But helping people become more cognitive processing therapy, so working through their different thoughts and memories surrounding their PTSD experiences, as well as mindfulness, accepting the thought and kind of not giving it any weight, saying, yes, this is a thought I have, but I have to understand that the things I did, I have to let go. The things that happened to me, I have to let go. Different exposure techniques. Now, you can't put someone back in a combat scenario, but there's different ex vivo techniques that can be used to kind of simulate and help imagine the scenario so someone can work through it. Couple and family therapy is important for, again, giving that person that social support at home to help them work through their trauma, as well as group therapy. Group therapy is great for helping people have mutual supports and insights. It always helps to know someone who went through the same things you did. I'm going to stop right there and pick up on dissociative disorders in part 2.